Agenda Briefing Forum of the Town of Victoria Park Council open. Begin by acknowledging the traditional owners. I am not a Noongar woman, I am a non-Indigenous woman. I am honoured to be standing on Whadjuk Noongar country on the banks of the Swan River. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and respect past, present and emerging leaders, their continuing cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, which continues to be important today. I thank them for the contribution made to life in the town of Victoria Park and to this region. Item 3 on the agenda is announcements from the presiding member. Item 3.2, notice of recording and live streaming. All participation in the meeting will be audio recorded and live streamed on the town's website. The live stream will be archived and made available on the town's website after the meeting. Item 3.4, public participation time. There are 2 opportunities to ask questions and make statements at the beginning and at the end of the meeting. Each public participation time will be held for at least 15 minutes if required. Any additional time must be by agreement from the meeting and will be in 5-minute increments. For this electronic meeting, all questions and statements from the public have been received ahead of the meeting. These will be read by myself and I will call on relevant senior staff members to provide answers if required. 3.5, questions taken on notice. Responses to questions taken on notice that relate to an agenda item will be presented in the officer report for the ordinary council meeting agenda under the heading Further Consideration. Responses to general matters taken on notice will be made available in the relevant ordinary council meeting agenda under the section Responses to Public Questions Taken on Notice. Now move to item 4 on the agenda, which is attendance. In attendance, we have myself. We also have Councillor Claire Anderson, Councillor Rhonda Potter, Councillor Wilfred Hendricks, Councillor Luana Lissandro, Deputy Mayor Bronwyn Ife, Councillor Vicky Potter, Councillor Brian Oliver, Councillor Jesvin Karimi. We also have joining us, I believe by telephone, the Chief Executive Officer, Mr Anthony Valletta, the Chief Operations Officer, Mr Ben Killigrew, the Chief Financial Officer, Mr Michael Cole, Chief Community Planner, Ms Natalie Martin-Good, the Manager of Development Services, Mr Robert Cruikshank, the Manager of Governance and Strategy, Ms Danielle Uniza, and the Minutes Secretary, Ms Amy Noon. There are no apologies and we have no approved leaves of absence. If I could inquire, please, of the Chief Executive Officer, if there are any declarations of interest, please.
No, there's no declarations of interest, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr CEO. I'll now move to item 6, which is public participation time. And I can inform the elected members and the public that no questions were received in relation to tonight's agenda briefing forum from members of the public. We do, however, have a statement and I will now proceed to read that statement out. The statement relates to item 11.1, scheme amendment for additional use, cafe and/or office at 53 to 55 Canning Highway. The statement is by Mike Davis. Dear Mayor, Councillors and Executive Staff, I'm writing on behalf of my client, Kingsfort VP Pty Limited, in support of the officer's recommendation in relation to item 11.1 relating to the proposed scheme amendment to introduce an additional use of cafe at 53 to 55 Canning Highway, Victoria Park. As noted in the officer's report, this request relates to a site which received development approval for a 23 multiple dwelling apartment development by the Metro Central Joint Development Assessment Panel on the 15th of August 2019. In assessing this application, the town's design review panel noted that a desirable outcome would be for the future development to incorporate a cafe or equivalent tenancy at ground level to assist in activating the corner of Taylor Street and McCallum Lane, and to improve passive surveillance over the adjacent Taylor Reserve. We would like to note our support of the officer's recommendation and note that the town does not support the inclusion of office as an additional use. We accept this recommendation. The site is already surrounded by a mix of commercial and residential development and is in an area of high amenity located adjacent to Taylor Reserve and the Swan River foreshore. The addition of a local scale cafe tenancy in an area of high amenity represents a good planning outcome, as also acknowledged by the town's design review panel. A cafe would also be consistent with the town's objective for the McCallum precinct being as a major node of recreation and leisure activity. The cafe tenancy would be subject to a separate development application process and, if approved, would replace the communal lounge area, being an area of approximately 100 square metres in total. This would represent a small local scale cafe operation, which would be commensurate with the residential amenity of the area. It is anticipated that the future local cafe would rely on localised patrons coming from the use of the Swan River Foreshore Reserve and local residents. We have previously stated that there is no intention to place directional signage on Canning Highway associated with a future cafe, as it is intended to serve the local area only. We note that 3 submissions were received which objected to the proposal. However, this represents a very small proportion of the overall community which would undoubtedly benefit from a local cafe operating in the area. For reasons outlined above, we therefore support the officer's recommendation and respectfully request that Council initiate the scheme amendment for the purposes of public consultation. That concludes the public statements. I now move to item 7 on the agenda, presentations. We have none. Item 8 on the agenda, deputations. We have none. Item 9, method of dealing with agenda business. There are none. I move now to item 10, the Chief Executive Officer reports, and begin with item 10.1, resolutions from the 2020 annual meeting of electors. I'd like to invite Councillor Rhonda Potter. You have some questions in relation to this item, please.
Thank you, Mayor Vernon. Yes, I do have a couple of questions. I will ask a few in relation to one item and then ask the others. My first question is, could we have a bit more of an explanation behind the officer's decision to exclude the option of a safe, active street along Rutland Avenue between Miller Street and Bishopsgate Street?
Thank you, Councillor Rhonda Potter. I'll invite the Chief Operations Officer, Mr. Ben Killigrew, to address that question, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just checking you can hear me okay?
I can, thank you, yes.
Okay. The principal shared path funding has been secured from the Department of Transport with an objective to deliver a principal shared path, or PSP. If a scope change is considered, then funding from the DOT may be put at risk. The off-street PSP solution incorporates quite a wide footpath that is deemed to be a safe option, which separates motorists from cyclists and pedestrians. And as such, it also provides a very consistent approach for a very significant pathway that stretches from Perth to Armidale. The outcome was to support a PSP in order to secure that funding, but also then to work with the community on investigating aspects of a safe, active street to ensure a sort of a positive outcome for the community members that raised their concerns. The safe, active street type treatments could be investigated for this section of road, but we would recommend that a PSP should be supported as planned.
Thank you, Mr. Killigrew. I'll now invite Councillor Potter to ask your next question, and you can proceed, Councillor Potter, on the basis that ask your question, I'll invite the relevant officer to answer, and then you can simply move to your next question when the answer is heard. So please state your next question.
Thank you. Just following on from that, if we were to proceed with a trial of a safe active street, do we have a bit more of a time frame around this, and who from the community might be considered to be involved?
Mr. Killigrew?
So at this stage, we've been impacted in our community engagement by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, our intention was to undertake engagement in the 2020-2021 financial year. No discussion, however, has been held with the Department of Transport as the funding body for the PSP, and we need to be careful that if we're considering any change in scope, that we need to be cognizant of their investment. We also propose, we would propose that in terms of who from the community involved, that the residents of Lathlane would be consulted, as well as users of the public shared path network and cycling peak bodies.
Thank you. My next question is with regards to a motion that was brought forward that council develop a schools and youth community outreach program to educate youth about the role of local government. The officer's response has focused on a much broader scheme with the suggestion of a development of a youth plan for the town to be considered. I'm just wanting to know maybe some reasoning behind the broader approach, and with that, will the outreach program mentioned before be instilled in this approach anywhere?
I'll direct that question to the Chief Community Planner, Ms. Natalie Martin-Good.
Thanks for your question. Absolutely, it will be included, that it will be targeted at local government. I think it was probably a bit remiss that we weren't more specific in the comments in the report. Very happy to include some further comments in the report just to clarify that it is about the role of local government. The reason that the comments were so broad is that first we want to understand current demographics and what the youth of Victoria Park would like to contribute, and more importantly, how they like to contribute. Youth tend to use different mediums, and we want to make sure that we engage with them in a medium that they feel comfortable. So absolutely, very happy to provide some further comments in the report.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Potter, do you have any other questions?
Not related to that item, thank you.
Thank you. I'll then move on. I have an indication, Deputy Mayor Ike, you have some questions in relation to this item.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mayor Vernon. In relation to Resolution 1 and the safe active street, I would think that there would be a number of people who'd like a similar thing out the front of their homes. Is there going to be some sort of an opportunity to assess whether this is the most appropriate place to trial this particular safe active street idea?
Thank you. I'll direct that question to Mr. Killigrew.
Thanks, Mayor Vernon. There are many other streets in the town where a safe active street option might be more conducive to this type of road design. An example, as outlined in the town's current joint Town of Vic Park and City of South Perth bike plan, is the stretch on Gloucester Street between Kent Street and Armagh Street, which is listed within that plan. So yes, there are many other areas where a safe active street might be more relevant.
Deputy Mayor Ike, if you have any other questions about this particular item, please proceed with that.
I did, but Councillor Rhonda Potter already pretty much asked it, so I won't make the staff repeat themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. I also have recorded a question from Councillor Hendricks. So I'll invite Councillor Hendricks if you would like to ask your questions, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Vernon. I have a couple of questions, and the first one's to do with Resolution 1, and the Council sort of recommended action that the Council proceeds with the design of the principal shared path as planned, utilising 2.2 million from the Department of Transport. The section of proposed PSP along Rutland Avenue between Great Eastern Highway and Bishopgate Street is currently used by many cyclists and is very dangerous for them due to the road being narrow and also the fact that there's a bend on a blind bend on the top of the hill. This section of road should be a private priority. So my question is, will this section be done next? And also, as an adjunct to that, the majority of properties along this section of Rutland Avenue are set back from the road. Can this land be available for Rutland Avenue to be realigned, thus allowing for an uninterrupted wide PSP along the railway side of the road? The reason I'm asking that question is also the fact that I thought when this motion was brought forward at the special electors meeting, I think the idea behind it was that the money that they can save doing that section up be directed to work on this urgent area. So that's the reasoning behind why I'm asking this question as well.
Thank you, Councillor Hendricks. I'll direct that question, please, to Mr. Killigrew. And Councillor Hendricks, if you could please mute your audio for the answer.
Thanks, Mayor Vernon. And I concur with Councillor Hendricks on the street in question, having formerly been a cyclist. Stage 3 of the town's PSP project is funded by the Department of Transport, and that stretches from Miller Street to Great Eastern Highway, with construction planned for in the next financial year, 2020 and 2021. We're currently undertaking construction works for stage 2 from Oates Street to Miller Street. And due to the narrow roadway and carriageway, including retaining issues, essential service relocations, so power and the like, and other quite complex private property impact matters, we are working on currently. Stage 3 has been left as the last stage for the construction of the PSP. And in relation to the use of the road verge, yes, the major road realignment is required for stage 3, and this is to ensure that proposed facilities such as the PSP and other way carriage and other features can be accommodated within the road reserve. The wide property setback is likely to accommodate a road realignment and ensure that the PSP design is acceptable to our funding partner and safer for road users.
Thank you, Dan.
Mr. Killigrew. Councillor Hendricks, did you have another question in relation to this item?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Mayor Vernon. The other one's to do with Resolution 6. And the question is, again, in the Office of Comments, it's mentioned that public open space CCTV has no evidence of preventing or reducing crime. And my question is, did the officer contact the cities of Canning, South Perth, Melville and Stirling and inquire what effect their portable CCTVs have had in reducing or preventing crime and coming up with a statement?
Thank you. I'll direct that question to the Chief Community Planner, Ms. Martin Good.
Yes, I can confirm that their Town Safer Neighbourhood Officer did contact the officers of those various local governments. That feedback was anecdotal and it was varied. Some believe that it was of benefit, others believe that it was not of benefit. There wasn't any documented data to support that, it was anecdotal. However, there is, we've also based that column based on research and from the Australian Institute of Criminology. So there is research to substantiate that as well.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Hendricks, did you have any other questions about this item?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Can I ask, are there any other elected members who have a question that they want to ask about item 10.1? No? All right, then we will move on to item 10.2, which is the quarterly reporting for April 2020. I have a note here of questions by Councillor Oliver. Councillor Oliver, if you would like to ask your questions.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. With regards to the town's 5-year capital works program, from a resourcing perspective, what capacity does the town have to deliver those works if council was to bring forward works in the outer years for its 2020-21 budget to support economic stimulus as part of the COVID-19 recovery?
Thank you. I direct that question to Mr. Killigrew, the Chief Operations Officer.
Thank you, Mayor. In short, our internal resource to deliver and contract manage much of our capital work program is at or beyond capacity. However, we can aim to refocus our project delivery internally and also use external resources where necessary to build this capability or capacity. There are many capital items within the town's draft place plans that could be assessed for delivery in a shorter time frame than expected. However, I'd have to liaise with the manager for place on these. There are also opportunities to reconfigure the 5-year capital works program as part of the recovery process in order to focus on a post-COVID world, if you like, where the themes and narrative of our current budgets will have changed. There are some additional road renewal projects that are not that complex though, that don't require major design work and may potentially be accommodated for delivery in a shorter space of time.
Thank you. Councillor Oliver, did you want to proceed with your other questions?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Follow up to that question, which I think the Chief Operating Officer has already answered, but based on the town's 2019-20 expenditure, could he please indicate what percentage in terms, what increase in capital works expenditure could be accommodated by staff if council was to increase its capital works expenditure in the upcoming budget?
Mr. Killigrew?
Thank you. So of the capital budget being approximately $20 million, it would obviously depend on the complexity of any new proposed expenditure and the time taken to design and deliver. So a strategic project's capital expenditure component would be more difficult to bring forward than, for example, a road resurfacing or minor building renewal, such as a roof replacement. I expect that if we were to bring our road renewal forward, we might be able to increase some expenditure on these projects. However, we have already increased expenditure on road renewal through our mid-year budget review by a significant amount. It's also worth noting, however, that we are expecting a stimulus capital expenditure funding from the state and federal governments. I'm not sure when that will be, but if this were to be delivered and we were to be lucky enough to receive some funding, that may also impact our capacity to deliver any new projects.
Thank you. I have 2 questions regarding the strategic community plan. With regards to the corporate business plan update, in the update for the major review of the strategic community plan, the notes section state that it is proposed that engagement be delayed until early 2021 and delivery in late 2022. Is this meant to be late 2021? And my second question is with regards to the major review and adoption of the strategic community plan, what date are we statutory required to adopt our next SCP?
I direct those questions to the Manager of Governance and Strategy, Ms. Yuniza.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In response to the first question, the date is supposed to be 2021, not 2020. So I'll make sure to update that report to reflect those changes. And in regards to the statutory due date, in accordance with Reg 14D of the Local Government Administration Regulations, we're required to review the current strategic plan at least once every 4 years. Granted that it was last adopted in 2017, it is due for review next year, which is 2021.
Councillor Oliver, do you have any other questions in relation to this item 10.2?
Just on that date, do we have up until the 31st of December next year?
I suppose it doesn't say in the regulations that it's from the date of adoption. It just says once every 4 years. And I suppose on that note, the regulation doesn't also differentiate between a minor and major review, noting that we did do a minor review last year, when setting the review requirement. I do note that your question was about the statutory deadline, and I suppose just looking into that further today, the differentiation between the two types of review actually come from departmental guidelines. So I guess in this instance, we can just say 2021, possibly before the end of the year.
Does that assist, Councillor Oliver? Thank you. In relation to item 10.2, I just have two quick questions. The first of which is, when is the Rutland Avenue shared bike path section between Oak Street and Miller Street that's currently underway scheduled to be finished? I'll direct that question to Mr. Killigrew, the Chief Operations Officer.
Thank you, Meg. Construction is imminent and is likely to begin within the next month. And completion is expected by mid to late 2020 at this stage, although this schedule may be impacted by happenings in and around the world.
Thank you. My second question, on the assumption that the Rutland Avenue shared bike path between Miller Street and Great Eastern Highway is approved as a project in the next budget, when would the project be likely to commence? Mr. Killigrew?
So it has been included on our draft capital budgets to date, and obviously dependent on all things impacting us at the moment, and then resolving some of the project complexity I talked about earlier. It may take more than one financial year to deliver, but Department of Transport has committed to officers that the $2.2 million has been allocated to fully fund the project.
Thank you, Mr. Killigrew. Are there any other elected members who wish to ask questions about item 10.2? No? In that case, we'll move on to item 11 on the agenda, the Chief Community Planner reports, and specifically we'll move now to item 11.1, the scheme amendment for additional use, cafe and or office at 53 to 55 Canning Highway. Are there any questions from elected members? Councillor Hendricks, you have your hand up. Councillor Hendricks, you're free to proceed with your question.
Sorry, I was on mute. So, thank you, Mayor Vernon. What my question was, it's in relation to do with the parking in the close vicinity, and one of the comments from that came through was that they're always full, and she backed it up with lots and lots of photos. Is there any? Is the town considering putting parking restrictions in that area, so at least that will open up more parking spots for people that maybe do want to use the cafe? So if I can have that answered, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hendricks. Might inquire of the Chief Community Planner whether the Manager of Development Services wishes to answer this question, or you consider it actually belongs to the Parking Services section under the Chief Financial Officer. If someone could give me an indication, please.
I'm not aware of planning having any knowledge of that. I would actually consider that would be something that our parking staff would need to provide comment on.
Thank you. In that case, can I inquire the Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Cole, are you able to address Councillor Hendricks's question about whether there are any proposals for parking restrictions in that area at McCallum Park and Taylor Reserve?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Hendricks. Not aware of any proposed changes or parking restrictions in that area. It's one that I can take up with the team and probably report back for the council meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Councillor Hendricks, did you have any other questions about this item?
No, that was it. I was just trying to open up more parking for if there was going to be a cafe there. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hendricks. Are there any other elected members who wish to ask any questions about this particular item 11.1? No, in that case, we will move on to item 11.2, draft local planning strategy. Are there any elected members who have questions about this item? No, we'll move on to item 11.3, draft local planning policy, vehicular access for residential development. I already have a request for questions from Councillor Hendricks.
Thank you, Mayor Vernon. Actually, this is probably more relating to probably an oversight, but on page 7, my question is, why isn't Archer Street and Robert Street not included, or sorry, why isn't it included in the list of streets or roads considered to be primary or integrated arterial roads for the purpose of the design element 5.3.5 of the R codes in accordance with figure 5 on page 8. Like I said, it's probably an oversight, because if you look at the figure on page 8, it does include Roberts Road and Archer Street, but they're not listed on the list on page 7.
Thank you, Councillor Hendricks. I'll direct that question to Mr. Cruikshank, the Manager of Development Services.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Hendricks. Councillor Hendricks is quite correct. The map that appears on page 8 does identify Roberts Road and Archer Street as being higher order roads. For one reason or another, they were not consistently listed on page 7 as well. So that oversight will be addressed in the report that comes to the Ordinary Council meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Cruikshank. Councillor Hendricks, did you have any other questions about this item?
No, that was it. Thank you, Karen.
Are there any other elected members who have a question about item 11.3? No, in that case, we will move along to item 11.4. Item 11.4 is amendment number 56 to Town Planning Scheme number 1, lots 1003 to 1005 on southeastern side of Roberts Road and Miller Street, adjacent to Miller's Crossing, East Victoria Park and Carlisle. Option to purchase land. Understand I have a question already pre-registered for Councillor Rhonda Potter.
Thank you, Mayor Vernon. Firstly, also, I'd like to thank you for moving to deferring this item at the last OCM. I appreciate that. I just have a really broad question in relation to this. I'm just wondering if there has been any correspondence from the WAPC with regard to the impact of COVID-19 on any major land transactions and major land developments.
Thank you, Councillor Potter. I'll direct that question to Ms. Martin Good, the Chief Community Planner, please.
We've not been advised by the West Australian Planning Commission or the Department of Planning of any changes regarding major land transactions. However, there is in terms of major developments, where there is an imminent minister's order under the Planning and Development Act, which will exempt some type of developments from having planning approval. We expect that to be gazetted this week.
Thank you, Ms. Martin Good. Councillor Potter, is there anything arising out of that answer?
Not at this point, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other elected members who have a question in relation to item 11.4? No, in that case, we will proceed and move on to item 11.5, revision and informal adoption of draft local planning policy 41, exemption policy for specified changes of use and activities carried out from existing buildings in response to the ongoing economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Understand to have a question from Councillor Anderson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Vernon. I note in the report that council officers have written seeking consent from the WAPC to waiver the public consultation period so that businesses won't be held up in the process. Can I have some feedback whether we've heard back from this request or not?
Thank you. Wonder if I might get an indication from Ms. Martin Good whether that question might be answered by yourself or the Manager of Development Services.
Happy for it to be either, but I'm happy to give a response. Robert, let me know if you want to. So we haven't got a formal response from the WPC yet, and the answer I gave before about the emergency order, that does contain some provisions where public consultation is either exempt or reduced. We have seen a draft of that. However, if that draft is different to the Minister's order, it remains to be seen. So hopefully that'll be gazetted this week and we'll let councillors know ASAP.
Thank you, Ms. Martin Good. Councillor Anderson, does that assist, or do you have any questions arising out of that answer?
Yes, I do. Just a question in relation to the announcement from the Minister that may be coming in the next couple of days. I'm wondering whether Mr. Cruikshank would be able to advise around that.
Sorry, Councillor Anderson, the last part of your sentence dropped out for me at least. Are you able to just say it again, please?
Oh, yes. Apologies, Mayor Vernon. Just in relation to the announcement from the Minister that will be made in the next couple of days, and the fact that the town has actually come forward with this policy and we're actually leading in this area, I'm wondering whether there's any extra information that can be shared particularly from Mr. Cruikshank in relation to this.
Thank you. Refer to Mr. Cruikshank, the Manager of Development Services.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As mentioned already by the Chief Community Planner, the emergency order anticipated to be released by the Minister this week deals with a number of issues and putting aside a number of planning requirements that would otherwise apply under town planning schemes, and that includes, based upon the draft that has been cited, potentially the issue of consultation relating to local planning policies. I guess also having looked at the draft notice that's been prepared, what's noteworthy is that many of the potential contents of that draft notice potentially pick up on the very things that this draft local planning policy already does in terms of exempting particular uses from planning approval. So it's good to know that I guess some of the things that we were already thinking about are being looked at by the state.
Thanks, Mr. Cruikshank. Councillor Anderson, anything arising out of that further answer?
No, thank you. That was great.
Thank you. Are there any other elected members who have any questions in relation to this item 11.5? No, in that case, we will move on. Now moving to item 12, Chief Operations Officer reports. Item 12.1, surrender of HISP PTY leases and proposed disposal of the town's leisure facilities cafe spaces. Are there any questions from elected members about this item? No, in that case, we'll move on to item 12.2, naming of right-of-way 80. Have a registered question from Councillor Rhonda Potter.
Thank you, Mayor Vernon. I just recall some discussion around having some signage that would explain these, the naming of these areas, and I just wondered if this row was considered in having signage to explain the reason behind the naming?
Thank you. I'll direct that question to the Chief Operations Officer, Mr. Killigrew.
Thank you, and thanks to the Chief Community Planners team who helped with this one. But the further consideration confirmed that information regarding the origin and history of the names can be included on the site in various forms. For example, a sign or a plaque can be hung under the New Street sign used to identify the right-of-way. The preferred method for delivering this outcome would, from our perspective, would be worth workshopping with elected members at a future concept forum.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Killigrew. Anything arising out of that, Councillor Potter?
No, that's fine. Thank you. I look forward to being presented with that at the concept forum.
Thank you. Are there any other elected members who have questions about this item 12.2? No? In that case, we will move on to item 12.3, Town of Victoria Park Waste Reform Submission. Are there any questions from elected members about this item? I have an indication of a question from Councillor Hendricks.
Thank you, Mayor Vernon. I've got a couple of questions on this one. Firstly, is to do with the detailed actions that's listed in the plan. It says to it says to work with community groups and charity groups to identify ways to extract reusable items and purge bulk waste prior to collection. Now, I can't see that working, because by the time there's that many, when the bulk waste pickups there, there's people going up and down the streets just collecting anything. So what's like? So the question is, how can you see this working? Because I can't, because there's going to be nothing worth collecting.
Thank you, Councillor Hendricks. I'll direct that question to Mr. Killigrew, the Chief Operations Officer.
Thanks, Mayor Vernon, and apologies if I didn't get the question right, but the upcycling, if you like, or reuse of items put on the curb during waste collections is considered a sort of a factor in the upcycling or the reuse of what would otherwise be waste. So I suppose our approach is to ensure that there is education delivered around that activity to the community, to ensure that it's done in a way that doesn't cause, if you like, a mess and doesn't cause pain for the community. But happy to restate that if I didn't answer the question.
Councillor Hendricks, does that answer your question?
Well, it's to identify ways to extract reusable items. I suppose the answer is there is more like educating before, I suppose, they get thrown out of the verge. So
well,
still,
Councillor Hendricks, at this stage, this is just an opportunity to ask some questions of the officers in relation to their report, rather than an opportunity for us to debate the merits of what's being suggested. Do you have any other questions in relation to this item?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I did have another one. It's to do with, it also mentions in the recommendations that they're going to liaise with the City of South Perth to increase the range of waste diversion activities at South Perth Recycling Centre. With the advent of the Aqua Centre they're going to build there, can that still be feasible?
Mr. Killigrew, to the extent that you're able to offer us your thoughts on that question.
Sure, I think there are question marks around the nature or final makeup of that facility and its location. But in the instance that the City of South Perth's transfer facility is no longer available, then we would have to retune, I suppose, the strategy to accommodate that.
Councillor Hendricks, do you have any other questions?
Thank you, Ben. And just one last one. Seeing that the CDS has been put back till a further year, is it possible to perhaps look at incorporating the CDS to perhaps collect recycled goods within the town and even set up within the town? Thank you.
Mr. Killigrew?
Sure, yeah. The container deposit scheme relates to the collection of specified containers. I think Councillor Hendricks is talking about sort of if you like, a way for that same facility to also collect and resell or repurpose waste as they do at the Mindarie Regional Council that the town is a part of. Look, I think if that's possible, depending on a whole range of factors, including planning and building regulations, but it has been something that we have considered in the strategic waste management plan as something that would be considered within the town as well. So yes, it's a possibility. No, we haven't got anything in front of us that identifies that as an outcome just yet.
Thank you, Vernon.
Thank you. Are there any other elected members with questions in relation to item 12.3? Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So on that basis, we will move on to item 13, which is Chief Financial Officer reports. And the first item is 13.1, Chief a schedule of accounts for February 2020. Are there any questions from elected members? Councillor Oliver.
Thank you, Mayor Vernon. I just had questions regarding the hire charges for Victoria Park Carlisle Bowling Club. There was charges for 12,800, 3,700 and 8,400. I was just wondering if we could get some further information what that was for.
Thank you. The Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Cole.
Through the Chair, thank you for the advance notice of the questions, Councillor Oliver. It was actually an incorrect description put on the list of accounts, so apologies for that. It actually relates to payments in relation to the contribution from the town towards the upgrade of the grandstand seating and shade at the bowling club. This was a project that was endorsed at the December OCM late last year. So those progress payments relate to that particular capital work project. Apologies for that, and I'll see if I can get that description updated for OCM.
Thank you. Councillor Oliver, do you have any other questions about this item? No, thank you. Any other elected members who have questions with regards to this item? No, in that case, we'll move on to item 13.2, financial statements for the month ending 29 February 2020. Are there any questions from elected members? No, in that case, we will move on to item 13.3, TVP 2004, provision of insurance services. Are there any questions in relation to this item? No, I'm not seeing any hands up. So we will move on to item 14, which is committee reports. The first of which is item 14.1, adoption of policy 005, acting Chief Executive Officer. Are there any elected members with questions in relation to this item? No, in that case, we'll move on to item 14.2, adoption of policy 022, elected member professional development. Are there any questions from elected members? No. Moving on to item 14.3, adoption of policy 024, event attendance. Are there any questions? No. Moving on then to item 14.4, review of policy 054, access to reserve funds. Are there any questions from elected members? No. We'll now move on to item 14.5, review of policy 111, commemorative recognition. Are there any questions in relation to this item? No. In that case, we will move to item 14.6, review of policy 351, parking permits. Are there any questions in relation to this item? No. We will then move on to item 14.7, minor review of the policies of council. Are there any questions in relation to this item? No questions. We'll move on to item 14.8, internal audit program. Are there any questions in relation to this item? No questions. We'll now move on to item 14.9, CEO review of systems and procedures, Regulation 17, update on outstanding actions. Are there any questions from elected members? No, no questions, in which case we'll now move on to item 15, which is public participation time. We have no further questions from members of the public. Move on to item 16, questions from members without notice on general matters. Now open the floor to elected members if you have any questions without notice on general matters. Please use the electronic hand raising symbol to identify if you've got any questions to be asked. Resounding silence, I shall call it. I shall say then that there are no questions from members without notice. Item 17, confidential matters, there are none. So the only thing left for me to do now is to thank elected members, to thank all the town staff for participating, declare our first agenda briefing forum by electronic means to be a resounding success. Thank you all for your informative questions. Thank you to those who have stayed with us on live streaming, and I hope that you all stay safe and enjoy your evening. And at 7:24 p.m, I now declare the meeting closed. Thank you and good night.